Good afternoon, Professor. Can you see me?
I can see you, Sir Brian.
And that, obviously, you can hear me as well. Good. That's a promising start. We should have an uninterrupted technological connection. If we don't, well, we'll just have to bear with it. Let me describe the scene for you, because you won't have been, I suspect, in our hearing room in Fleetbank House. It's a very large room. It's capable of holding around 200 people when it's full and when COVID restrictions don't apply. At the moment, however, it has less than 10 in it. I'm looking across the room to three members of the legal team, all wearing masks except for Miss Richards for obvious reasons. Then there are three other members of the inquiry staff here. There is Shumik, whose job it is to make sure you can see the right document when it's referred to. Two others, one of whom is Mary, who will ask you to swear the oath. For those who are watching at home remotely, let me describe your position. You can tell us, are you at home? Are you at home? Can you hear me? You can't.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're talking to me?
Yes. Right.
Yes, I'm sitting in my study at home. Thank you.
Right, and your solicitor and your counsel are elsewhere. I think your counsel is Mr. Bowie, and we may hear from him in due course at the end of the hearings. Miss Richards.
I think Mary needs to swear Professor
Lowe
in first.
Thank you.
Please state your full name.
Gordon Douglas Ogilvie Lowe.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Professor Lowe, I'm going to start with a brief overview of your career, insofar as relevant for the inquiry's purposes. Between November 1974 and December 1977, I understand from your statement that you were a registrar in general medicine at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary.
That's correct.
And you've told us in your statement that in terms of the amount of time you spent on different responsibilities, it was about 50% teaching and research and about 50% clinical general medicine, with haemophilia, or bleeding disorder, care and treatment, representing only about 1% of that. Is that right?
That's correct. It was an academic unit, so I was expected to do teaching and research for half of my time throughout my career. And the rest of the time I was training in general medicine, and that involved rotation amongst various specialties, coronary care, etc. And in that 3-year period, I think I only assisted at the Hemophilia Centre for about 6 months.
And then between January of 1978 and September of 1985, you were a lecturer and honorary senior registrar, still at the Royal Infirmary, and again with a similar division of responsibilities, 50% teaching research, 50% clinical medicine, with a very small proportion of that being haemophilia care. Again, around 1%, you put it in your statement.
That is correct. Just really helping out if there was nobody else around to assist with a visiting haemophilia patient.
And then from October of 1985 through to September of 2009, you continued to hold an academic post, in due course being appointed professor. And from December of 1985, you were a consultant. Again, your responsibilities were approximately 50% teaching and research, 50% clinical medicine. And for this period of time, you've estimated the amount of time spent on the clinical side in relation to haemophilia and bleeding disorders as being in the region of about 10%. Is that right?
That is correct, because I was by that time the second consultant on the unit, assisting Dr. Forbes as co-director, and I shared with him both reviewing patients on the wards who were admitted, patients at the review clinic, and consultant cover.
And in terms of the directorship of the clinic, of the Haemophilia Centre, it was under Dr. Forbes and Dr. MacDonald's directorship at that point at the end of 1985, and you assisted them for the period through to the end of 1987, and then in 1988 you became co-director with Dr. MacDonald.
That is correct. The co-director at the centre was always a physician, member of the Department of Medicine. Initially Professor Douglas, Professor McNichol, and then Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice. And on the haematology side, which dealt with the laboratory service, the provision of blood products, and reviewing many of the milder patients and the inhibitor patients, that would be staff in the haematology department, of which Dr. MacDonald was head of department. Dr. John Davidson ran the blood bank and blood products laboratory, and Dr. Walker was consultant haematologist at the Royal Infirmary and the Royal Maternity Hospital.
And your statement says from 1991 onwards, you were co-director with Dr. Walker until 2009.
It was I think, I've checked, June 1990, Dr. MacDonald retired as head of department. Dr. Davidson succeeded him as head of the haematology department, and he continued to run the blood product and transfusion laboratory, but thought that Dr. Walker was keen to be my co-director, and that was that.
And you refer in your statement to UKHCDO approving your appointment as director. What was the role of UKHCDO in terms of offering some form of approval?
I think my predecessor would suggest that I would be co-director, and I think Dr. Forbes did propose that at UKHCDO, and that was accepted. But before that could happen, that had to be agreed between Professor McKillop as my head of department and Dr. MacDonald as head of haematology.
And you became a member of UKHCDO and remained a member until 2009. You've listed in your statement a number of other societies and organisations of which you're a member. There are just two I wanted to ask you briefly about. You refer to membership of the Scottish Society of Experimental Medicine between 1979 and 2009. Could you just tell us briefly what that is and what your role was?
Yes, so that is the Scottish equivalent of the Medical Research Society. So basically it's a professional society that holds regular meetings where you report research findings of all kinds. So London being a long way away, from about the 1950s, I think, the Scottish Society of Experimental Medicine was its equivalent, and it would meet about 2 or 3 times a year, alternating between Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen, which hosted it. And in particular, it was the junior doctors who were doing research and training who gave the presentations, but occasionally at consultant level. So it was a wide variety of experimental studies, be it laboratory or clinical.
And the second organisation I was going to ask you about, I think you may have already answered. It was the Medical Research Society. So that was the UK-wide body performing a similar function, was it?
That is correct. So I visited that less often, obviously, but maybe every year or two, usually because I had offered a presentation which they accepted.
Can you recall whether during the time that you were a member of either society, you presented any findings in relation to research or relating to patients with bleeding disorders? I
can't remember, because my main research interest, as I think my written statement makes clear, is that my research was very much on the thrombotic and vascular disease. I cannot recall presenting any haemophilia research findings. I did very little research in haemophilia.
Now, I want to ask you next a little about the centre, the Haemophilia Centre or Service at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. You've given us a very detailed history in your witness statement, and I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but I have a handful of questions about how it worked, and then I want to ask you a little about the facilities and staffing. What was the relationship, in particular in the 1970s and 1980s, between the University of Glasgow and the Royal Infirmary?
Oh, very long-lasting. So the Royal Infirmary dates from about 1780, when it was set up as a charitable institution. And it was right beside the original medical school of Glasgow University, which was just down the road. So right from the start, there's very close collaboration between Glasgow University Medical School and the physicians and surgeons who served at the Royal Infirmary. And there was a lot of come and go between them. There's quite a detailed history of the medical faculty on the University of Glasgow website, which my colleagues and I wrote, and I think I've given you the web link. The university moved across to the west side of Glasgow in about the 1880s, and at that time the new Western Infirmary was built, and the academics were split on two sides of town. So both at the Royal Infirmary and the Western Infirmary, there was a Department of Medicine with a professor, a Department of Surgery with a professor, Department of Obstetrics with a professor. So it was split across two sites, and both sides were very active in research and in clinical care, working respectively in the Royal Infirmary in the east and in the Western Infirmary in the west. The Royal Infirmary in particular was interested in obstetrics and gynecology, and the Royal Maternity Hospital was just a short walk from the Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and that's where Professor Walker developed an interest in perinatal hemostasis, and in particular the treatment of women with congenital bleeding disorders and carriers, and looking after them during pregnancy and delivery. So she was the hematological and hemophilia, if you like, consultant from about 1978 there, as well as with Dr. Davidson and Dr. MacDonald in the Royal Infirmary. So that was their contribution.
And what, if any, impact did that relationship and those close links between the university and the infirmary have for the care and treatment of patients with bleeding disorders?
So, Professor Douglas, Dr. Douglas in 1950 was a registrar under Professor Davis, who was the Professor of Medicine at the Royal Infirmary, and his interest was in haematology, and he wanted to set up a haemophilia service for the west of Scotland. So in 1951, Dr. Douglas went down to the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, which you'll know as the premium centre in the country, and he trained for 2 years with Doctors McFarlane and Biggs, and they invented a new coagulation test which resulted in the two different types of haemophilia, haemophilia A, factor VIII deficiency, and haemophilia B, factor IX deficiency, being distinct diseases needing different treatments, ending up, of course, with factor VIII and factor IX concentrates. So he made a big contribution. He then came back in 1953 and with Professor Davis spent 10 years collecting all the families in the west of Scotland. And he would interview them all, take a family tree, take blood samples, and spend the rest of the day working out, did they have factor VIII or factor IX deficiency? What was the severity? And the Medical Research Council, which organized haemophilia centers at that time, would then have the patients registered. Every affected patient would be given a haemophilia card with their name, contact details, general practitioner, blood group, and very importantly, the address and telephone number of the center. And they were educated about the disorder and told if at any time they had a bleed or trauma or surgery or any other problem, ring the center, and the center would then arrange appropriate treatment. Now, the west of Scotland was a very diverse area with many hospitals, and I think I sent you as an appendix to my written statement a kind of diagram which indicates that patients obviously would show the card to a general practitioner. The general practitioner would know they're a patient with haemophilia. They could ring the Royal Infirmary Haemophilia Centre for advice about treatment, and treatment could be given at the local hospital, of which there were several, which I've listed. And the patient could be referred to the local physician with an interest in haematology, who could order appropriate treatment from the West of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service, with advice, if required, from the centre. So a lot of the patients throughout the West of Scotland were treated, at least initially, at the local hospital. And obviously there would be correspondence between the local haematologist and the Haemophilia Centre. Now, initially, this was run by the Department of Medicine's physicians with an interest in haemophilia, which was Professor Davis and Dr. McFarlane. But then by about 1960, haematology was developing as a laboratory specialty, and departments of haematology were set up. And that was when Dr. MacDonald came from Aberdeen to Glasgow, and he pioneered the haematology department. Now, its responsibilities were then to not only provide the laboratory service and the blood transfusion laboratory locally, but to start to look after the clinical management of patients. And from this time, haematologists were starting to train not as pathologists, which they had been, but duly trained and accredited in medicine. And at this time, Dr. MacDonald, who'd done quite a lot of blood coagulation research in Aberdeen, and Dr. MacDonald agreed that they should share the centre. So the patients, going back to the facilities now, were reviewed on the University Department of Medicine's wards 2 and 3 at the entrance to Glasgow Royal Infirmary. They could turn up at any time of day or night, and the doctors and the nurses knew how to treat them, and they had the index of what treatment they needed. The hematology department then took over, continued to provide the blood transfusion, and they took over the routine blood tests for clotting factors, which Dr. Douglas had been doing in the Department of Medicine. So they provided the routine diagnostic measures, the monitoring of patients' factor levels and inhibitors, and of course the hematology routine tests. And they also took over the blood clinic. Now, the blood clinic had been set up by Professor Douglas, and basically the hematology department, Dr. MacDonald and colleagues, took that over, particularly for review of the mild patients with hemophilia or von Willebrand disease, who didn't need to, turn up often for treatment of an acute bleed. So by the time that I arrived at the Royal Infirmary in 1975, Dr. Douglas's successors, Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice, were the two consultant physicians who were still looking after most of the patients with severe haemophilia at the original centre. At the blood clinic, that was Dr. MacDonald, Dr. Davidson and Dr. Walker, and they continued to review many of the milder patients. But the centre was one in that they had a common register. All the patients were registered at each. It's just that it was more convenient for the milder patients to attend the blood clinic, which was run by the consultant hematologist, and the more severe patients would get their reviews. Often at the time they came up with severe bleeds. So it was a close collaboration between the two departments. The other, sorry to be long-winded, sometimes you get acquired haemophilia, where a normal person suddenly starts bleeding. Their factor VIII was normal when they were born, but they've developed an inhibitor, so they bleed just like a severe haemophiliac. And in particular, Dr. Davidson and Dr. Walker would be interested in managing them, because hopefully it was a curable condition, and once you treated the inhibitor, they wouldn't have lifelong haemophilia. Now, they had beds on one of the other medical units, Professor Lawson's unit in my time, and they would look after these acquired inhibitor patients there using the various treatments. So basically, there was a sharing of the patients, the severely affected hemophiliacs continuing to come towards 2 and 3, which they always had, and they knew it and liked coming there. The milder patients and the acquired inhibitors being reviewed at the blood clinic and only being referred to a haemophilia centre if they needed a special treatment. And as I say, Dr. Walker reviewing the woman with bleeding disorders at the maternity hospital. So it was spread over 2 departments in 2 hospitals, but it was coordinated and all the patients were registered at UKHCDO.
And if we just have a look at the numbers, Shomik, could we have up on screen, please, PRSE 302887. This is a statistical report prepared for the Penrose inquiry, Professor. And if we go, please, Shomik, to, it's probably page 30. That's the one, I think. So we can see if we could pick things up in 1975, we can see at Glasgow Royal Infirmary we have 103 patients with haemophilia A, 15 with haemophilia B, none at that stage registered, no females with factor 8 or 9 deficiency, 1 von Willebrand's disease, giving a total, I think, of 119 patients. And then if we go to the next page, please, Shomik. We can see for 1980 for the Royal Infirmary, we've got 197 patients with haemophilia A registered, 52 haemophilia B. There are now 5 females with factor 8 or 9 deficiency, 16 von Willebrand patients, and a total of 270. And then for 1985, we see for the Royal Infirmary 211 patients with haemophilia A, 56 with haemophilia B, 10 in total female patients with factor 8 or 9 deficiency, 36 von Willebrand, and a total of 313. I think the figures you give in your statement, Professor, are very slightly different, but it's a very marginal difference. So I think these are reasonably accurate. But can you assist?
Can I just say that they cover 5-year spans?
Yes.
And as a result, it can't be the case that each started with the number that we have and each finished with the number that we see for each 5-year batch, because there'd then be a cliff face change at the end of each 5-year period. So it's may reflect each and every patient who ever was registered during that period. It may reflect something else. It's not entirely clear from the wording. So I think I shall treat this, subject to any submissions later on made to me, as indicative of the overall numbers and of the trends. But I don't think precision is what it's about.
No. And I don't think we have any data beyond this that would assist in being more precise, sir. Professor, I don't know whether you can assist with this. Do you know whether these figures would be likely to include patients who are from the broader west of Scotland area and are treated both at their local hospital and from time to time through the Royal Infirmary, or would this just be patients who are seen at the Royal Infirmary?
These would be patients who are registered at the Royal Infirmary, but that was the reference centre for the whole of the west of Scotland. And I think what you are seeing in terms of the increased numbers of patients registered is firstly that haemophilias were becoming more common, because as you may be aware, in the 1970s, half of haemophiliacs died before they reached the age of 40 from bleeding. It was a very unfortunate disease if you didn't have adequate treatment. So a number of patients surviving, but also increasingly the number of patients registered who had been identified particularly with milder haemophilias by the various hospitals of the west of Scotland. And some of them just hadn't been picked up. A mild haemophiliac can go for years and then suddenly have surgery and they bleed a lot and they're found to be a mild haemophiliac. So it's the increasing numbers of milder patients being identified and referred and definite diagnosis made, and the patients are registered. So that is the main increase.
Thank you.
You'll see also, sorry, that von Willebrand's disease is increasingly being recognized by more modern tests, and the numbers are increasing.
Thank you. Chair, you can take that down. In terms of the adult-child divide, we heard yesterday and the day before from Dr. Pettigrew and Professor Han, the effect of their evidence was that there wasn't a precise age at which a patient would transfer from York Hill to Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Was that your experience too? It might depend upon a range of factors, but broadly it was mid, sometimes late teens.
That's correct. So in Scotland, a child becomes an adult legally at 16, but as I think Dr. Pettigrew and Dr. Han have been saying in the past couple of days, the admission, the arrangement between the Royal Hospital for Sick Children and adult hospitals, such as the Royal or the Western, was that round about the age of 12 or 13, you'd start thinking about it. But Dr. Pettigrew, I think, made the very valid point that particularly for patients with severe haemophilia who were often admitted to hospital, education was very important. And York Hill, of course, had teachers to carry on the education of the child, whereas we didn't at the Royal Infirmary have any such thing. So it was dependent. The age of transfer we left very much to the Haemophilia Director at York Hill to decide. It would depend on the maturity of the child, the severity of the child, and often there are haemophilic siblings, two brothers, for example, and you have to think, do you want to transfer the older one first, or should we wait until the younger one is of age? And then, so it was very much up to the children's director to decide. And at that point, they would have a discussion with the adult centre, and then often a joint review, usually at York Hill, with, okay, here we are, what do you feel about coming over? And a transition would be arranged.
Do you know whether the Royal Infirmary Haemophilia Service was always adults only, or were children initially treated there in the 50s and 60s?
I think they would be registered there, but the Royal Hospital for Sick Children was always the place of care as far as I recall. And I think my wife trained as a pediatrician there and as a medical student, and I think the patients were usually looked after by the professor of child health with the assistance of the haematologist. And there was always a very close link between the Department of Child Health at York Hill, the University Department of Child Health, and the University Department of Medicine at the Royal Infirmary. For example, the professor when I arrived in 1975 was Professor McGurr, and his interest was endocrinology. And Professor Hutchison had quite a lot of interest, but the two of them collaborated closely on studies of thyroid disease and familial thyroid disease. So there was a very close connection between the two departments.
When a patient transferred, a bleeding disorder patient transferred from York Hill to the care of the Royal Infirmary, what happened in terms of the treatment regime? Would the patient be kept as far as possible on the same treatment regime in terms of home treatment or type of product, or would there be changes?
I think that would be discussed. As you've heard from colleagues in the last 2 days, a lot of the patients at York Hill were on home treatment. And obviously the first question on transfer would be with the parents and the patients, what is the home treatment situation you've been having? And as you heard from Professor Han yesterday, it would be usually concentrate at that time for patients on home treatment, and you heard about the changes at different times of type of concentrate. And then, so what is the current concentrate? What is the current pattern of treatment? And that would be reviewed. And a point I'd like to make is that one of the many advantages of the Haemophilia Centre at the Royal Infirmary, I think probably uniquely across the UK, was that in our department we had not only the haemophilia doctors, Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice, we had endocrinologists, as I've mentioned, we had kidney disease specialists, but a very major part of it was the first academic rheumatology department in Glasgow. And it was a powerhouse of development in the 1960s onwards. So two of the consultants in the departments when I came were professors of rheumatology. And they had an adjacent hospital at Baird Street, which moved to join the Royal Infirmary in 1982 in a new university building. And Dr. Roger Sturrock, who later became Professor of Haematology, was in charge, and he had a very close collaboration with Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice, which intensified when they came to the Department of Medicine in 1982. And from that time, the rheumatologists were very closely involved with the monitoring of the patients. You'll have gathered that haemophilic arthritis is by far the most disabling and crippling complication of severe haemophilia. And they were very active in investigation of haemophilic arthritis. So from about 1982, the rheumatologists were very closely involved in monitoring patients at the haemophilia clinic. And from that time, they started doing detailed assessment of the arthritis developing in the knees, the ankles, the wrists and the elbows, the common sites of bleeding. And they would have X-ray measurements and measurements of function. And they had very specialized physiotherapists. So we had always a consultant rheumatologist with an interest in haemophilia and a specialist haemophilia physiotherapist. And they reviewed all the patients at the clinic in great detail. And studies were done from about 1982 by a senior registrar in rheumatology, Dr. Stephen, and by a registrar in rheumatology, Dr. Maddock. And the two of them did probably the most detailed study of haemophilic arthritis ever published in Britain, about 150 patients. And that was published in, I think, 1986. Now, coming back to the transfer, they would be very involved, the transfer of children, in assessing the child, talking to the patients, and saying, well, this is the current condition of your joints or your child joints. In terms of home treatment, there may be a case for continuing that. And the question then, if you're on home treatment, is it intermittent when you suspect a bleed, or should it be prophylaxis, which you've heard about, which is treating maybe twice a week to maintain a certain minimum level of clotting factor at which you'll get no bleeds, and that child will not grow up with arthritis, and that child will not grow up crippled and be able to complete their education and get a job. And that was clearly very, very important. So in terms of home treatment, the rheumatologists were always very much involved in making the decision together with the physicians who were looking after the patients with haemophilia. So
if you had a child transferring from York Hill to the Royal Infirmary in 1980, 1981, who'd been treated with predominantly or perhaps exclusively commercial concentrates, reflecting Dr. Willoughby's practice at the time, would there, and maybe you can't answer this because of your limited involvement, if you can't, please say so, would there have been a presumption that the patient would continue to receive commercial concentrates in accordance with the treatment they'd been receiving at York Hill? Or was it a completely fresh decision?
Well, the answer, as you've guessed, is I don't know, because apart from a 6-month spell in 1976, I was never the junior doctor assisting Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice at review of the clinic. I think, having said that, if a child had been, the commercial concentrate was being used by Dr. Willoughby, as you've heard, but we used very little at the Royal Infirmary. We only used commercial concentrate if for things like surgery, and tried wherever possible to use the NHS factor concentrate. So that, I think, would have been the general policy, but I can't help you about any particular children involved at that time.
Can you help us a little more broadly with the how care would be managed between for the patients who were not Glasgow residents, whose local hospital was elsewhere in the west of Scotland? How patients would be managed as between the local hospital and the haemophilia service in the Royal Infirmary?
Okay. What my predecessor directors, I think, ideally liked, would have been a direct annual review, which is patients coming from as far away as the Isle of Skye in the northwest, or Stranraer, which is almost Ireland in the southwest. But obviously patients were reluctant to travel that distance. It was a whole day out. So there was a general preference to just go to your local hospital, and they had plasma, they had cryoprecipitate, and in due course, if it was agreed with the reference centre that concentrate would be preferable, that could all be supplied by the local branch of the SMBTS, which in general would be the West of Scotland Blood Transfusion Service. But I think my predecessors were quite keen to have an annual review if possible, or at least a discussion with the local haematologist as to what was going on, just so we could keep in touch with the patient in case in the middle of the night some emergency happened. The local haematologist, there was a good network amongst Scottish haematologists, and my impression is that the local haematologist wouldn't hesitate if they had a problem to ring up the centre or discuss. But in terms of treatment, many patients preferred their local hospital. I can remember at the Penrose inquiry being asked the same question, and I said, oh, well, patients preferred, if possible, to attend the local hospital rather than make the long and dangerous journey to Glasgow, at which Lord Penrose announced that he was from a town about 20 miles from Glasgow, and he would agree that that was a long and dangerous journey, and he would rather have stayed there.
I want to ask you next about records and record keeping at the Haemophilia Centre. As far as you can recall from your time there, how and where were records relating to bleeding disorder patients kept?
So every patient had case records, obviously. For severe haemophiliac, these could become several volumes, several feet high over the years from the number of admissions that they had. And we always wanted to keep all the records available in the haemophilia unit. Now, as you know, records can be destroyed at intervals by managers and records departments just wanting to keep their shelves clear. But there was a general recommendation by the UK Genetics Disorders Society, or whatever it was called, can't remember, that it was preferable that these records not be destroyed. And there's a very good reason for that in patients with haemophilia, because as you'll know, it's transmitted by female carriers and it skips generations. So if a patient, say, dies and the records department say, well, that's that, destroy the records. The problem is that 40 years later, some granddaughter becomes pregnant and wants to know if she's a carrier and what kind of haemophilia was it. So in general, we tried to keep all the records in the haemophilia centre, and the number of filing cabinets increased from about, I think, one when I arrived in 1975. At last count, I think it's about 20 filing cabinets. And if a patient died, we would put them in a locked cupboard within the haemophilia centre, because we occasionally had the problem that the records department said 7 years or whatever is the current policy and would destroy them. So we tried to retain them as much as we could. But in practical terms, we had a small folder in the unit, as I think many other centres did, which listed the basic details of the patient and what treatment they were on, and information like the family tree and the UK HCDO registration number, so that if a patient turned up in the middle of the night and for some reason the case sheets had gone missing, they'd attended another clinic, they'd gone to a surgical ward for operation, we had the essential information that was needed to know what kind of haemophilia it was and what the treatment would be.
When you retired in 2009, Professor Lowe, were the records, hard copy records that you've described that might be multiple files, still kept within the filing cabinets within the Haemophilia Centre?
Deceased patients would be in a locked cupboard in another room. We kept obviously only instantly accessible, the recent records of patients who were live. And then if they stretched back too far, they were again put in a kind of storage cupboard but could be accessed if required.
And do you know whether patient records were destroyed or lost through moves or through computerisation at any stage whilst you were director?
I think we were pretty good. So we had on the front of every case record a big stamp routinely saying, please return notes to Haemophilia Centre. Do not remove. Do not destroy.
I want to move on to the question of what products were used. And again, I'm conscious that your involvement in decision making in relation to products would have been limited until or non-existent or limited until 1988. But I'm going to invite you to look with me at the same report again, just so that we can get some of the basic data. PRSC 00028887, please, so the statistical report again, to start with. And if we could go, please, Shomek 2. I think it's probably page 20 electronically. Yep, so we've got the records there for Glasgow Royal Infirmary. We can see, if we look, for example, at 1974, substantial volumes of cryoprecipitate being used. And then in terms of factor concentrates, it's a range of different commercial concentrates in smaller volumes, cryobilin, travenol / Hyland / hemophil factor 8. We can see 1975, again, a substantial volume of cryoprecipitate, but now for the first time, factor 8, PFC factor 8, in large quantities. I think we've seen it in smaller quantities in previous years. And again, commercial concentrates, a range of different commercial concentrates being used. 1976, we go slightly down the page, thank you. Again, we can see substantial volumes of cryoprecipitate, but increasing volumes of the PFC factor 8 and still a mix of different commercial concentrates. If we just go further down, please. Shomek, could we go to the next page then? Again, if we look at 1978, we can see it's still a substantial amount of cryoprecipitate, but increasing amounts of the PFC factor 8. Can you assist, please, Professor, with what Proplex was? It appears to have been a commercial factor 9 product, is that correct?
Yes. It sounds like it was only used once. I think it was probably used for an inhibitor patient. So as you may know, the treatment of factor 8 inhibitors is very difficult. The treatment varied over the years. Porcine factor 8 was used at one time because bad reactions. So from, I think, about 1976, some patients were treated with what was called activated factor IX concentrates. And the concept there is the manufacturer had not just plain factor IX, but something that was slightly activated, usually with a kind of secret recipe according to each company. And there were reports by, I think, the mid-1970s that this was a useful and effective agent in patients with inhibitors who were actively bleeding. Some centres in the UK tried to use the NHS factor IX, and there were mixed results, and quite a lot of the times it didn't work. So I think in that situation, Dr. Forbes and Prentice would be using these so-called activated factor IX concentrates. And Proplex, I think, might have been one of them. And if you look just 3 lines above to FIBA, that's factor VIII inhibitor bypassing activity, which essentially is another type of activated factor IX concentrate. And the proportion of these FIBA and Proplex type commercial products is they're all commercial, and they're all some kind of activated factor IX concentrate, and they're all used for patients with inhibitors. Now, the number of patients with inhibitors varies a lot from year to year, and some of these patients may be acquired inhibitors. They appear and disappear, so it's a changing small population. And according to the state of knowledge, Dr. Prentice and Dr. Forbes, in the patients admitted to their wards, or indeed the patients with acquired inhibitors admitted to Dr. Davidson and Dr. Walker's wards, they would make the appropriate choice of product, which would be based, I would guess, on a balance between efficacy, cost, and safety. One of the safety problems with these products is thrombosis. If you give people high factor IX levels or activated factor IX, there is a risk of thrombosis. So the decision was constantly changing over the years. On that point, if you look at the UK HCDO minutes, which I'm sure you do, there was a special working party on inhibitors in which Dr. Prentice was particularly active, and I think he ran that from about the mid-1970s until he left Glasgow in about 1983. And he had the very daunting task of trying to get unanimity across the UK in practice, for which the best evidence-based solution would be to take the 2 most promising treatments and see if they could organise a randomised controlled trial across the UK haemophilia centres in collaboration with the manufacturers to see which might be the most effective and at the same time the most safe of these concentrates.
And then we can see, if we move on into, or in 1979, we see DDAVP appearing for the first time. And then if we move down to 1980 and beyond, we can see, and I'm not going to go to the precise figures, Professor, but we can see the use of cryoprecipitate declining in the early part of the 1980s, and the predominant treatment being the PFC factor VIII, again, still with some various commercial products being used. If we go then please over the page, Shomik, and we look at the top half of the page, again we can see the volume in terms of cryoprecipitate declining, although slightly increasing again in 1983, but not to the previous levels. And then we can see, although there's a line for DDAVP in 1983 and 1984, in fact no volumes there put in. And with the PFC again being the main product for the treatment of haemophilia A. So there is a table which shows this similar to the tables that we've produced for the other centres, if that is of assistance.
Sorry, Mr. Richards, could I ask you just to stay on that page? Because I think this is actually more helpful in terms of the distribution and discussion of the products than the one which I've been receiving the last few days. So the first thing I'd say is that the revised one is problematic because DDAVP is grouped with FIBA, and that is inappropriate because they are quite different products. So DDAVP, as you may know, is a synthetic drug, and you give it by infusion to raise factor VIII levels in patients with mild hemophilia, or to raise von Willebrand factor levels in patients with mild von Willebrand's disease, and you use it so you can avoid the use of any blood product. And could I just say that because it's a synthetic drug, it took quite a few years, even though it was starting to be used about 1977, for the UK HCDO database to include it and ask for use of DDAVP to be sent in the annual returns. And it was probably only 1985, when you have it there, 735, that it was by that time it was asked for in the annual returns. So it's not that we weren't using it in those years, it doesn't feature in the returns, and that was a policy decision. But could I say that my memory was that from 1977, when we published the first infusion brigade with DDAVP, we were very keen to use it in Glasgow Infirmary because obviously it spared patients from having blood products. Fiber I've mentioned, and it's used for treatment of patients with inhibitors, and that fluctuated from year to year. But most important, can I just comment on the shifting balance between cryoprecipitate and PFC factor VIII concentrates? So this obviously is the majority of patients who have mostly severe or moderate hemophilia A. And as you may know, the SMBTS Protein Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh was increasing its output, and it was about 1983 that it approached the UK and Scotland aim of self-sufficiency, and that was almost enough to meet the needs of all hemophilia A patients, and that was why cryoprecipitate use was decreasing, because cryoprecipitate, as you know, is a product which has many disadvantages, as you've heard in the inquiry, and the PFC concentrate was taking over. But then, if you just to go to 1985, you've observed that there's a bit of an increase in cryoprecipitate use here. And that is because, of course, that was 84-85 was the period of time when AIDS was very much in the headlines, and there were various pronouncements from, in fact, I think 1983 from memory, by UK HCDO saying, oh, not sure about this AIDS risk, and in selected patients, infrequently treated, we should be using cryoprecipitate rather than concentrate. So that was my recollection, and again, I'm a historian here, not a direct observer. That would account, I think, for the increased use of cryoprecipitate.
Yes, could we just look at the top of the page again, please, Shomek? Sorry, Professor, I just want to go back to one point one observation you made. You suggested, I think it was probably surmise rather than your own direct knowledge, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that the reason why there may be no volumes of usage of units for DDAVP and 83-84 was because annual returns didn't have to include that data. But we do in fact see that for the years from 1979, and we can see above the example for 1982, Glasgow had included that data. Are you able to say, as a matter of your own knowledge, or help us with, as a matter of your own knowledge, why we see no usage here recorded for DDAVP in 83 and 84?
I've no knowledge because, as I think you know, 1983 and 1984, I wasn't even on the Department of Medicine wards. I was transferred to another unit. But it does surprise me that, you know, it wouldn't have been used. And I can't explain why it's not recorded.
There are two questions. The first is that there's an asterisk against DDAVP. In both occasions when there is no entry made, The second, which you may be able to explain while Ms. Richards is looking to see what the answer to that one is, 538 units of DDAVP. Now, the units, this may be an attempt in one column to put a standard measure of comparison as between all these various products. Is it appropriate to regard that as the same sort of unit as the international units of factor 8 or factor 9 activity used in the others?
Well, thank you, Sir Brian. It's completely different because as a synthetic drug, these from memory are micrograms. So it's the micrograms that you're infusing from a vial, having been diluted with saline and given by slow intravenous infusion of up to about 30 minutes. So my guess is, I think it's micrograms, but I'll probably get into trouble for getting the units wrong. But it's that kind of thing, and that is completely different, as you say, to an international unit of factor 8 or factor 9, which is what you see in all the blood products.
So although the table may give us a measure of comparison between cryoprecipitate on the assumption that a bag contains so many units, and the calculation, so far as factor 8 and factor 8 PFC are concerned, and Travenol, for that matter, Highland Hemophil, it would be wrong to think that because DDAVP, for instance, in 1982 is 538, that it shows how little use was made of DDAVP compared to the others. It's not easy to work it out, is it, from that?
I think, Sir Brian, the most appropriate measure would probably be the number of DDAVP infusions given, because it's dependent on the weight of the patient, and I'd be more interested in the number of infusions, which would tell me how many patients with mild hemophilia A or mild von Willebrand's disease have been appropriately given a synthetic product rather than have to use a blood product, which in those years would probably be cryoprecipitate.
It follows that because you're viewing this as an historian, you can't really help us with with anything impressionistic as to the amount at that time, or can you?
I wasn't really involved in the completion of the annual returns of product use at the Haemophilia Centre until I succeeded Dr. Forbes in 1988. 1988 is the first year that the haemophilia sister would complete the forms and I would check them and sign them off. So I never did this before 1988.
If we just go to the next page, because we'll see the data for 1988 onwards. We can see, if we just take by way of example 1988 DDAVP 1400, although it's obviously larger than the earlier years, it would seem as though it may be using the same unit of measurement.
Yes.
Can you recall how, in the period of time when you were director, Professor Lowe, DDAVP usage was reflected in the returns?
You mean how many years was it recorded?
No. How did you capture, as the director responsible for the submission of the return to Oxford and then Manchester, how did you capture DDAVP usage as far as you can recall in the returns?
I think it was the total number of micrograms infused to all the patients. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Or how the haemophilia sister would keep a record in every patient's notes of the dose infused, and then she would add them up monthly and give the total number of micrograms given to all the patients, is my recollection.
So in answer to your question about the asterisk, we're told in relation to each of these tables means not included in the usage per diagnosis figures, but we don't see it just as an asterisk against DDAVP. For example, in relation to the Edinburgh tables, we see it appearing against factor concentrate. So quite what it means, we probably have had to ask Professor Hay, or can subsequently ask UK HCDO.
Well, this is a statistical report prepared for the purposes of the Penrose inquiry, isn't it?
It was, and we're making our own investigations.
Yes, I mean, it's really work done by others on the basis of raw material or factual material. This is a comment, in effect, and it doesn't, on the face of it, it appears to equate the usage of DDAVP on the same sort of basis as the use of concentrates and others. It just doesn't.
Shomik, that can come down now. Professor Lowe, your statement suggests that in terms of how products were obtained at the Haemophilia Centre, they were obtained through what you've described as the Glasgow Royal Infirmary Blood Bank and Blood Products Laboratory. Can you explain what the difference is? What was the Blood Products Laboratory as opposed to the Blood Bank at the Royal Infirmary?
So they were both really set up by Dr. Davidson in, I think, the early 1970s when he became a consultant hematologist. And Dr. MacDonald said, right, you're running the blood bank in Glasgow Royal Infirmary. So the blood bank received all the blood and blood products that were produced by the West of Scotland branch of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. And that was based initially out at Lowe Hospital in Lanarkshire. They coordinated the preparation of blood, of plasma, of cryoprecipitate, which was prepared locally. And they would obtain from the Protein Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh the concentrates that were made by SNBTS, which was the factor 8 concentrate and the factor 9 concentrate. So it was a bit of a journey. So starting with the patient arriving on the ward at the Haemophilia Centre, the Haemophilia Centre would order, and that would usually be the Haemophilia sister or the Haemophilia registrar. They'd ring up the Glasgow Royal Infirmary Blood Bank, which was run by Dr. Davidson, and usually, of course, they would have a stock of the appropriate product, and they would have to order it. They would issue it from stock, they would reconstitute the product, and then have the blood porter bring it over to the Haemophilia Centre, where it would be infused by the Haemophilia sister or Haemophilia doctor. They had stocks of the PFC concentrate, which I think had to come from Lowe Hospital. That's the first stage of the journey. The second stage of the journey is for Dr. Davidson to get that on, I think, a weekly basis generally, from Lowe Hospital and put it into the blood bank. Now, a section of the blood bank didn't deal with blood. It dealt with the blood products. So I think it was in the same building. And that was where Dr. Davidson was very meticulous in, obviously, the stock control, in the making up process. And he was very keen, I think, to have a process by which, if a new batch arrived, he would check that the stated dose on that batch in the vial was what it was. You know, he was always very keen whether it was a commercial concentrate or an NHS concentrate as quality control to keep an eye on that. So that was the process. And at times of increased demand, I think Dr. Davidson was quite busy, because he would say, right, a patient's developed an inhibitor, send us more than we usually need. Or a patient's having major surgery, I need an extra 50,000 units of factor 8 just to have there to cover that operation. So the demand would fluctuate. So it was a very interactive process.
Your statement says that you and your predecessors as directors could not make the final choice of and could not order blood products. This, your statement says, could only be done by consultant haematologists in the Royal Infirmary's Blood Bank and Blood Products Laboratory, which would have been, at the time we're most concerned with, up to 96, Dr. Davidson. Now first blush at least seems a slightly unusual arrangement, that the ultimate decision about what products to be kept and used by the service, or for the purposes of the service's patients, was in the hands of someone other than the primary treating clinician.
I think you're right, because in a haemophilia centre, generally, it would be the same consultant hematologist who was assessing and reviewing the patients, who was in charge of the blood bank, so he or she would order it from themselves, as it were. But by law, it has to be an accredited hematologist running in charge of a blood bank or blood products laboratory, who is in charge of the stock taking and the issuing. So all the products issued would have to be approved and recorded by a laboratory hematologist. It couldn't be done by a consultant physician like my predecessors, and that would be in order Dr. Douglas, Dr. McNichol, Dr. Forbes, and Dr. Prentice, and it couldn't be done by me. So right up to my retirement in 2009, I couldn't order it myself. I had to go through the duty hematologist to request it.
Your statement might give the impression, and we'll look in a moment at a bit of Professor Forbes's evidence in the Penrose inquiry, which might strengthen that impression, that it's not just a question of the mechanics of the ordering or quality control system, but that the actual decisions as to shall we have a Highland product or a Travenol product, how much SNBTS product should we keep for use, were not being taken by the primary treating clinician, but by Dr. Davidson or in the lab. Is that correct?
It would be a discussion. It would have to be a discussion. So if, say, you have a patient with inhibitor and it needs an unusual product, one of these products that you need to treat a patient with inhibitors, there would be discussion if the patient presented to the haemophilia centre, right, we've got an inhibitor patient, this is the situation, you measure the inhibitor, and then we'll have a discussion as to what we think the best treatment would be. Now, in terms of treatment of patients with inhibitors, I think that the decision would very much be with Dr. Davidson and Dr. Walker, because they were treating all the patients with acquired inhibitors, and they had a lot of experience. But it would essentially be a consultation between the clinician and the hematologist. But by law, it has to be the hematologist who does the ordering. So I don't think there was ever any problem with it, because UK HCDO guidelines were always consulted, and they gave a fairly clear guidance as to what were the advantages and disadvantages of different patients having different treatments.
Yes, you're right, of course, that there were UK HCDO guidelines for most, if not all, I think, at the time when you were a director. But the guidelines that you may be referring to, which set out the detailed products and the pros and cons of each, I think were first drafted in the second half of the 1980s. So there weren't similar guidelines before. I just want to ask your observation on a piece of Professor Forbes or Dr. Forbes' evidence in relation to this, please. Seamus, it's PRSE 306017. So it's an extract from Professor Forbes' evidence to the Penrose inquiry in April 2011. Seamus, could we go to page 130, please? If we pick it up in the bottom half of the page at line 17, we can see the question that's put to Professor Forbes. Can I just ask you about the situation as far as the decision-making in relation to acquiring concentrates and prescribing them to patients? Were you responsible for making the decision as to whether to use concentrates? Was that one of your responsibilities? Answer, I don't think it ever was. The only time that we insisted on a concentrate was where there was major surgery. For all the other situations which were not, and if we go to the top of the next page, as severe as that, we were happy to be told what was available. And then the next question, as far as what concentrates to use were concerned, was that your responsibility, or answer no, never? And then there's a discussion about it being mostly NHS concentrates, and the answer is, at line 8, very little of the commercial material was ever purchased, I'm told. And then at line 10, the question is, and again, that's as a result of being told by others as to what was being used or not being used. 12, well, we were guided by SNBTS. And then at line 14, we were told what they had in store and in stock. As far as you're aware, from your own knowledge of how the centre and how decision-making worked, at least by the time you became director, is that an accurate description?
So Dr. Forbes is talking, I think, at some distance, because he was long retired and his memory was not very clear, as you probably gathered from the Penrose descriptions. I think there was always a very close collaboration between Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice and the haematologists. After all, the history was that Dr. Douglas and Dr. McNichol in 1962 agreed to run a joint service. And throughout the 1960s, they trained their successors. And their successors in the Department of Medicine were Dr. Forbes and Dr. Prentice. And in the Department of Haematology were Dr. Davidson and Dr. Walker. So they all knew each other. They all worked together. They all wrote papers together about the development of cryoprecipitate and other products. So they were very, very closely linked. And I think it probably wouldn't have involved much discussion as to what type of product was appropriate for a particular patient. I think what Dr. Forbes does refer to, however, is that there were times, particularly for the PFC factor VIII concentrate, the NHS concentrate, when there was a shortage. And I think that's probably what Dr. Forbes was referring to when he's saying if it was in stock. So the general preference, for example, might have been to always have NHS concentrate. And Dr. Forbes is absolutely right. If somebody's having major surgery, you must have concentrate. You can't rely on cryo or plasma. The patient's just going to bleed. But regarding the choice between SNBTS factor VIII concentrate and a commercial one, I think there were times before SNBTS became self-sufficient when sometimes there was no alternative but to use a commercial source of factor VIII because there was nothing else available. And I think if you look at the figures, it's particularly during those years of the maybe 1979 to 1983 period, because 83 was the year that PFC could produce, I think, just about for just about all the patients in Scotland, an NHS factor VIII concentrate. That was a shortfall, and that was when occasionally you had to use a commercial factor VIII concentrate. I suspect that's what he was referring to.
The system that you've described, and indeed that Professor Forbes described, taken together with what we see from the statistical report, which suggests that a number of different commercial concentrates were used in various years, might suggest that there was no batch dedication system or batch dedication policy in operation. And certainly I don't think I've seen any reference to there being such a policy at the Royal Infirmary. Are you in a position to assist with that?
So batch dedication, I think, was a separate issue. From what I understand, the batch dedication system probably started maybe about 83, 84, and that was the distribution within the PFC factor VIII concentrate. It was produced in batches, and I think the arrangement was that it would be useful to reduce donor exposure if when a batch arrived, you could use it, you could allocate it to, say, a third of the patients on your books, and then the next batch was the second third, and the next batch was the third third, and that was something like the letters of the alphabet for patient's name. So A to H would get batch one, and et cetera, et cetera. And the idea of that was not about having enough versus commercial concentrate. I think the idea of that was that batch dedication reduced the number of blood donors or plasma donors to whom the individual patient was exposed.
Yes, the description you've just given us echoes the evidence that Professor Ludlam gave, and the documents we've seen would suggest that that's late 84 or early 85. Is it right then to understand that at the Royal Infirmary, first of all, there wasn't prior to that arrangement, any express policy of keeping a patient, first of all, on the same type of concentrate at all times?
Well, I think the policy at Glasgow Infirmary Haemophilia Centre was very much that of UK-HCD as a whole, in that, or indeed international haemophilia care. Changing a product always was undesirable if possible, because if you keep patients on the same product, that was thought to be good haemophilia care. You needed a good reason to change the product. To have to switch from one product to another was, I think, principally a problem because it seemed to increase the risk of inhibitor formation, which was the most dreaded complication of treatment traditionally. That if you switched products around, for some reason the immune system in the patient would be triggered to produce inhibitors. I think that was the main reason for trying, if possible, to keep patients on the same product.
And you're not aware of any system of batch dedication prior to the one that you've just described?
Sorry, no, I'm not. I think you would have to ask Professor Walker.
Could we look then at a document which...
Are we turning away from this particular issue?
Looking at questions of allocation as between different centres is the next topic, sir.
Yes. Let me just ask you this. Your description of how the system worked in the Royal Infirmary was that it depended to an extent upon what was in stock in the stores at the GRI. Is that right?
Yes, I think in particular in my time, from memory, it was about middle of 1988 when, as you'll see well documented in the Penrose Inquiry report, there was a shortfall of manufactured PFC factor VIII concentrate that affected the whole of Scotland. That was partly due to less being produced and partly because of an increased demand of patient use, being surgery or whatever. And at that time, there had to be a decision as to, okay, we're going to have to supplement the PFC concentrate by purchase of a commercial concentrate. And the general policy agreed by the Haemophilia Centre directors in Scotland is, bearing in mind what I've just been saying, we want to minimize the number of patients switched from one product to another. So we want to limit the number of patients who go on to a commercial virally inactivated product compared to an NHS virally inactivated factor VIII concentrate. And who should those patients be? So the general decision, and you'll see it in the minutes of the Scottish Haemophilia directors, is that it would be highly desirable to keep children and the infrequently treated patients and patients in the smaller centres, Dundee, Aberdeen and Inverness, keep them going on the NHS product. And then Edinburgh and Glasgow as the bigger centres, some of whose patients had previously been on commercial concentrates, those will be the patients, the minimum number if possible, that we have to switch for a period of time to the commercial ones. And that's the best way of ensuring that the patients in Scotland with factor VIII deficiency are kept on the same product. And that's important not only because of the general principle of avoiding inhibitors. Sorry, I'm sorry, Sir Brian, I'm getting a little tired, but let me just think for a minute longer. Yes, in 1988, as you probably know, we were very keen to set up a previously untreated patient study or a minimally treated patient study, and we wanted to have the maximum number of patients who'd had little or no treatment available to be invited to join the study of the viral safety of the SNBTS products. So we wanted very much to not mess things up by throwing commercial product around at these patients, because it was very important to monitor the safety of the virally inactivated SNBTS products.
So suppose that for particular reasons, if there were any, it had been thought desirable that the patients at the GRI should have commercial concentrate in preference to PFC. The effect of what you're saying, I think, is that wouldn't be feasible, because the SNBTS wouldn't stock the product in the GRI, and therefore you wouldn't be able to use it, and you had to use what you were given. Am I right?
Don't quite understand. Are you saying that?
Well, I'm exploring the question of the degree to which the treating consultant had the choice of product.
Well,
is it, in other words, deliberate or accidental that the commercial product was used when it was in the GRI?
In the GRI, as I've indicated, when I became co-director with Dr. MacDonald and Dr. Davison in the blood bank, these would always be joint decisions that we would have to make. They had to order the product and agree to its use in different patients. So it was a joint decision. We would have a discussion on what the policy should be. And everybody was agreed, I think, across Scotland in haemophilia centres, that you try to keep as many patients as possible on the NHS concentrate, particularly the children and the patients who'd had little treatment. And the relatively few patients who had to be transferred to the commercial concentrate would be patients who'd already had a commercial concentrate. That seemed an equitable way to do it.
Right, thank you very much. Yeah.
Professor, perhaps just one document to look at before perhaps we take a break. It's on a similar theme. It's SBTS 40687_127, please, Shomik. So this is a letter, May 1989, 16th of May 1989, from Dr. Ludlam to Professor Cash. And we can see, he says in it, I've discussed with Gordon Lowe the allocation of PFC factor 8 between Edinburgh and Glasgow, and we agree that the distribution for the financial year 1989 to 90 should be as follows. And then it's set out, and then there's further reference to an agreement with you for a transfer between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And then it concludes, for the time being, I should be grateful if you could arrange for the factor 8 to be distributed as above. Now, this would suggest that by 1989, the question of allocation between different parts of Scotland of PFC product was largely being determined by you and Dr. Ludlam. Is that correct? Is that a correct reading of this letter?
No, not just for two of us, because all decisions would be made with our fellow directors. So, for example, I would have to discuss this with Dr. Gibson at York Hill at the Children's Centre, and Dr. Ludlam would discuss it with his colleagues on the East Coast in Aberdeen, Dundee, and Inverness. And this, I think, was a joint agreement. It wasn't just Dr. Ludlam and I agreeing it as a cosy chat between two people, we had discussed this across Scottish Haemophilia Centre directors. So basically, the commercial concentrate would have to be purchased by the two largest centres in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary and Glasgow Royal Infirmary. And then the division of the financing would then have to be arranged between Lothian Health Board for Edinburgh and Greater Glasgow Health Board for Glasgow with the finance people. So this is talking about what haemophilia centre directors uniformly across Scotland want to do, and what this would involve with how do we buy commercial, because the commercial has to come out of the budgets of the two health boards, and they have to agree with that. And the details of that would be negotiated by Dr. Davidson in Glasgow Royal Infirmary, who was in charge of ordering the product, and with Dr. Ludlam in Edinburgh, who would have to order the commercial product. So this was across the board.
You've said you would have spoken to Dr. Gibson in relation to the position at York Hill. Do you know, and it maybe you can't answer this because of your limited involvement at the time, but do you know how, prior to you and Dr. Gibson respectively taking over as directors at the Royal Infirmary in York Hill, how the allocation as between the two Glasgow services, the two Glasgow centres, was determined? I ask you that, Professor, if I can just explain it, because we've heard from Dr. Pettigrew that in the early 1980s, York Hill would have liked a lot more PFC product, she said, or was her impression, and she suggested that might have been one of the reasons why they were using so much commercial. Whereas we can see that the Royal Infirmary did seem to have a substantial quantity of PFC product available to it most times. So do you know anything about how the allocation arrangements between the two Glasgow hospitals worked in the years prior to your directorship?
No, I don't, because I wasn't a consultant and I wasn't a co-director. Just to finish with Dr. Gibson, just to finish what you have up on the screen, Miss Richards, I think I've recently had correspondence between myself and Dr. Gibson discussing this very issue, and she's explaining about the problems of having to turn to commercial concentrate in her patients, very understandably, to which I was very sympathetic. And I think this correspondence from memory is Dr. Gibson writing to the financial directors in Glasgow explaining that if at all possible, Dr. Gibson wants to keep all the children at York Hill on the NHS factor concentrate. And basically that I was agreeable to saying, well, if somebody has to get commercial in the west of Scotland, I can agree that there's a strong case for that being the adult patients who've previously had commercial concentrate, and agreeing with that. Okay. Concerning, so going back to relationships in previous years between Glasgow Royal Infirmary and York Hill, I don't know. I think in the Dr. Willoughby period, I never met Dr. Willoughby, and I think he certainly communicated, particularly with Dr. Prentice, who was the haemophilia co-director at the time, about children and adults, but I have no direct knowledge of that. When it came to Dr. Han, again, I think he had a fairly close relationship with Dr. Forbes, who had become the co-director, and I think there was a lot more dialogue between the two. But that is really only my impression. I wasn't involved.
Thank you, Sir. I note the time. Would this be a convenient point at which to take a break?
Yes. Well, we'll take a break for, let's say, about 45 minutes. Would that be long enough for you to have a stretch and a cup of tea?
Yes, please.
Very well. We'll come back at 4:20. Would that be all right?
Thank you, sir.
During that period, as in any break, you must not discuss the evidence you have given or anything that you think you may yet be asked to say with anyone, whoever they are, your wife, anyone else. You can talk about whatever else you like. I look forward to seeing you back at 4:20.
Thank you.